Hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Michael Wiendl. I'm a course trainer at HEIDENHAIN, and today I would like to introduce you to the new functions of software version 18 of our TNC7. My guest today is my colleague from Product Management, Martin Ditz, who will also be happy to give us insights into our control from the development side.
My pleasure.
Well, Martin, it's been a year since we last met here.
That's correct.
And once again, quite a bit has happened with the software. Maybe you can give us a glimpse into what's been going on with the TNC7.
Yes, to be specific, we have done a lot in the software. We are now on the verge of releasing software version 18. In the concrete terms, we have implemented over 900 enhancements and improvements with software version 18 for the TNC7. One example has to do with the tables on the control, where we will show you a few things later. There, we implemented over 200 improvements to make working with the tables much better, for example. But Mike, I think we'll start with the hardware topics first, because even in the hardware area, regarding the control panel of the TNC7, I can tell you something right now. There is something new, namely the TNC7 Basic. What does that mean? What is the TNC7 Basic? It's the successor control to the TNC620, a control for simpler machines with a maximum of 8 axes, but basically a full-fledged TNC7. The control panel of the TNC7 is 16 inches across, which means we are expanding the TNC7 HMI portfolio downward. The whole thing becomes more compact. The TNC7 Basic is available either with a full keyboard or with a machine operating panel for pure touch operation. And there's something else that's new. In addition to the TNC7 Basic with a small 16-inch format, we will also be offering the TNC7 you see here with 24 inches in a smaller format in the future. That'll be 19 inches across, with the same range of functions as the large 24-inch TNC7, but for smaller, compact control panels. The great thing about the entire TNC7 HMI portfolio is that all 3 expansion stages of the TNC7 have the same identical user interface. We have a very high full HD screen resolution everywhere. All 3 screens have the same resolution, regardless of their size. This means that we have a razor-sharp, perfect display everywhere, and with the smaller formats we scale the display accordingly, so that everything on the buttons, everywhere the text has to be read, is perfectly recognizable. That's it regarding the hardware. So I'd say let's talk about the software now.
Very interesting, Martin. Yes, of course, there have also been some changes in the software. For 2 years now, we have had a lot of contact with users, machine manufacturers, and application engineers, and the questions that keep getting asked are, what is so unique about the TNC7? What in particular do you enjoy the most? And that's why I'd like to take you along with me and show you a few highlights that the TNC7 already has, because people often forget what the control can already do if they look at only the new functions. So let me briefly start with what it can already do. For me, a real highlight that came with the last software, with version 17, are the NC sequences. This is simply that we as application engineers have always wanted. It means that we can simply define NC sequences ourselves, which we then store as blocks in the control. And so we no longer have to follow the previous method of finding, marking, copying, and pasting blocks. Instead, we can insert our NC sequences directly into the program and adapt them. And that's something that really makes the whole task of creating programs much easier. But Martin, maybe you also have a highlight feature that you would like to introduce.
I even have 3 personal highlights. Maybe the best way to do it is like this. You tell everyone 3 personal highlights, and I also present my 3 personal highlights. You've already mentioned the first one, the NC sequences. One of my 3 personal highlights is the Documents workspace with extremely ingenious functions. So we'll wait a sec while Mike opens that up quickly in the background here. Everywhere, no matter which operating mode I'm in, I can always open the Documents workspace. So here we have PDF files with fixture situations, for example, or even Office documents. No matter what I want, pictures, 3D models, anything you need on the machine that you just don't want to print out anymore because the whole world is going digital anyway. Just get it on the screen and move it to the place on the screen where you need it at the moment. That, I believe, is a small but very nice feature that I've come to really appreciate. So, on to your next favorite feature.
Meine nächste Lieblingsfunktion ist eigentlich eine.
My next favorite feature is actually a continuous process chain. That's what I really like so much about the TNC7, that it has so many functions that we actually need. It means that we can simulate the first side, save the finished result as an STL file, and then use our CAD model optimizer to turn the part over, prepare it for a second side, so to speak, and then use this prepared 3D model for the second side again via our model-aided setup, and use it to set up the workpiece. So we also have the reference to our first side right away and can quickly and easily set up parts directly on the machine.
Brilliant idea. Yes, and of course what must not go unmentioned among my favorite features is our graphical programming. What does that mean? Well, it's a whole new way of contour programming that we introduced with the TNC7 via touch gestures. You no longer need to do anything at all about NC programming. Instead, I can simply draw contours on the screen with gestures, then later enter the actual contour dimensions, and then either export the whole thing as Clartext program code or integrate it into the NC program. I can also simply select existing contours from the NC program and swipe them into the graphic editor to edit them there. A totally ingenious way to quickly change something in the NC program, and it's also a lot of fun.
Yes, definitely, especially in the case that I have to change a starting point of the contour. It's so easy to do with graphical programming. Just drag and drop, make a quick adjustment, and insert it back into the NC program. Well, speaking of programming, being able to simulate is a huge asset when programming. And it happens time and again in real life. When you're standing with a customer at the machine, programming workpieces with him, and then you say, okay, let's take a quick look at the simulation. Often we hear the objection, well, I don't really need a simulation on the control anymore. But here I am so well equipped with the TNC7. This means that I can run through a supremely realistic simulation of the workpiece. The complete machine model is stored in the control. I have my fixtures, my holders, my tool geometries, and the complete workpiece model. And so I can display the material removal simulation where collisions are also checked for, where limit switches are checked, where my complete machining process is run through once again for me so that I don't, for example, mix up a plus or minus sign somewhere in a cycle. Or perhaps I've programmed a movement in Y instead of X. These are simple keystrokes that can easily be overlooked. But thanks to the simulation on the TNC7, we are very safe here.
Then I'll just quickly present the third highlight for me personally. Everything is becoming more and more digital. You just have to write some quick emails. You just have to quickly edit a Word document somewhere, and you don't want to have to run away to the office, away from the machine. Instead, you'd prefer to do it directly at the control. That's what our Remote Desktop Manager function is for. And the great thing about the TNC7 is that we have the option of embedding an external desktop, a Windows PC, completely seamlessly. There's a workspace for that. It's called PC, and when you start it, Windows opens. This can either be your workstation computer or an IPC in the machine's control cabinet. It doesn't matter. And you see, depending on how big the space available for it is, the size of this Windows desktop is automatically adjusted. It can also be made large, like if I say, I need a lot of space now because I want to do something in a CAM system. That's not a problem either. And the ingenious thing is that the clipboard is connected, meaning that Windows communicates directly with the TNC7. Things that you mark in Windows can be pasted into the editor of the TNC7. So things like dimensions or text can simply be exchanged between both desktops via copy and paste.
Ja, Martin,
Yeah, Martin, that was a good overview about some of the familiar functions of the TNC7. But now we want to talk specifically about the new functions of the TNC7. What has software version 18 brought to control that is actually new? We simply want to tell you about and also show you a few highlights from the more than 900 new possibilities and functions mentioned by Martin. I would like to start directly with the highlight that has been requested for a really long time, namely the tool shape topic. Tool shape is a possibility where we simply attach the tool contour as a 3D model to the tool in the tool table. This means that, just as we have always done with our tool holders, we can now also store a 3D model of the tool as an STL model in the same way as a tool holder.
Und dieses 3D
And this 3D model, this STL file, is then also taken into account in our material removal simulation. The advantage for us is that we can easily simulate the workpieces even more precisely, and thus also react to such special tools.
in dem Fall, ja, beispielsweise einen Abzeilprozess zu verkürzen.
There are cases where we need special tools, for example, in order to shorten a face milling process, so that we don't have to mill back and forth over the workpiece for a long time, but instead we can simply use a special tool to mill the workpiece with as few cuts as possible. And here too, the TNC7 supports you in creating such STL files for our tool shapes. Namely, we can generate our model ourselves here. There's a very simple trick for doing this. We use our graphical programming workspace. We simply draw the shape of our tool here in our ZX coordinate system, and then we simply incorporate this into our NC program with our rotationally symmetrical workpiece blank, and then all we have to do is start the simulation and display the workpiece simulation here, and we have created the finished tool shape.
Den fertigen Werkzeugkörper erstellt.
Then we simply press Save in order to save it as an STL file.
Als STL.
If I can just get the right folder, then we can also put the whole thing right here in the tool shapes.
Tool shapes.
We'll just put it right here.
Mit reinnehmen.
And now we can simply display this tool in our tool management as a tool shape, for example.
Dieses Werkzeug als beispielsweise Tool Shape uns mit anzeigen lassen. Kurz einmal hin navigieren, wo
Just navigate to where our tool is located, and here we already see our Test 1 STL.
Test 1 STL. Und das ist das Schöne an der
And that's the beauty of this function, that it's so simple. I can either use prepared 3D models or simply generate such an STL file quickly on the machine myself for a tool that's missing.
The ingenious thing is you can really see the tool shape being used in the simulation. This gives the simulation a completely different and higher level of quality. This really makes a super impression. Now we have just been in the tables operating mode. I'd say we should just stay here for a moment, and then I'll tell you about what else is new in software version 18. As I already mentioned before, we have incorporated over 200 improvements and enhancements. To list them all would go beyond the time and scope of this webinar. So I'll start with the most important things and summarize them a bit. First of all, the machine manufacturer now has the possibility, as you can see here, of color coding the columns again. You may be familiar with the extended tool management that we have had up to now on our controls. This possibility was already offered with the other ones. Many machines are already equipped with it, and there the machine manufacturers had the possibility to simply define colors in order to make navigation in tables easier for the user and to provide a better overview. For example, tools in the magazine were displayed in green and missing tools in red. We have now included this feature on the TNC7. There, too, coloring of the columns is now possible. Another new feature is the ability to create new tables. For example, if you like to work with freely definable tables and save data to the table, then newly creating a table was previously a bit cumbersome. Now we have made this much more convenient. You can select your desired format template from the table via an easy-to-use wizard, and then very quickly start with the freely definable table. Also new here is the fillable form display that we have integrated into the TNC7. The forms can now be sorted more easily. You have a better overview. You can also rearrange these forms more quickly. This wasn't quite as simple with the older TNC7 versions 16 and 17. We have made it easier for you to work with these form displays. Apart from that, many improvements have been made in detail, simply to take off the edges of the tables operating mode to make working with the tables even more convenient and easier for you as a user.
Yes, thanks, Martin, for the excursion into table management. But I'd like to say a little bit more about programming. We have introduced an extension to our collision monitoring feature. Collision monitoring has been around since the ITNC. In other words, it has been around for a very long time. So in the beginning, it was a live monitoring, a real-time collision monitoring that protected just the permanent machine elements. But more and more elements have been added. The tool holder was added. Later, the vise and other clamping devices were also added. And so, of course, all these elements came closer and closer together. And at some point, we reach our collision distance, because of course we can't say, okay, we can now approach from somewhere to zero distance to the clamping device, because at some point we also have to reduce the speed of the axes. And then at some point we also have to say, now we'll stop the axes. And that is not possible with a distance of zero. But we wanted to put it in the hands of the user, and for this we have added a function. This is called function DCM distance, for dynamic collision monitoring distance. And here, the end user can now enter his desired collision distance. I mean, absolutely down to zero. You probably don't want to do that, but if I say I would like to move past my vise at a distance of 0.2 millimeters because I have to calculate the workpiece blank very tightly based on my price specifications, for example, then I can now also do that while collision monitoring is active.
Previously, you had to turn off DCM if you had to mill at distances below 2 millimeters. If it was simply a tight squeeze with a clamping tower or other clamping system, then you might even have had to deactivate DCM because it just wasn't possible otherwise. Now we are much more flexible and can also work with active DCM down to almost 0 millimeters, depending upon what the user feels confident about.
The beauty of it is that the user decides, not via a machine parameter that he sets once and then has to always live with it, but instead he can simply program it with an NC function directly on the control and precisely for the area where he needs it. And if he doesn't need it, in the other areas where the tool and the clamping device are at a sufficient distance from each other, for example, he can then simply move again with the normal collision distance. The control system also shows him this directly by coloring the two clamping devices yellow. So he already knows, okay, something is being monitored here. We also protect the machine manufacturer by saying, okay, this change in the collision distance is possible only around end customer features. That means he can really approach the 0 millimeters, if desired, only to his defined vise, for example, but not to a machine part defined by the machine manufacturer. Right. We can take a quick look at the simulation. We have prepared a small workpiece where we can just take a look at what happens when we run our workpiece through here. We see, okay, we now have a turning operation here with one clamping device, and it stops here now. It stops because we could simply be too close to our clamping device, due to our clamping device being here with our workpiece on top of it. But I know from my CAD data that I have a distance of at least 0.2 millimeters. So I can simply go here and activate the DCM distance function. And so we can now simply tell the control, look, I know this area is tight, but I also know that we have 0.2 millimeters of air. If we have less than these 0.2 millimeters of air, the control system stops. That means I'm still moving while collision monitoring is active. I can also, if I want, interrupt the program and move free safely. That was the disadvantage when I switched off the collision monitoring feature. Because then, when I interrupt the program, I am still moving even though the collision monitoring feature is switched off. And then incorrect positioning can occur and I crash into something. And that's why we now see here that the program has run through. Some components briefly turn yellow, and so you can simply implement collision monitoring with a distance down to 0 here.
Great. Then I would say let's look at the next highlight of the TNC7 with software version 18. Let's jump to process process monitoring. Process monitoring is, after all, a feature that we introduced with the TNC7. It gives you the ability to monitor your processes without the need to install an external sensor in the machine. The TNC7 is able to handle the monitoring all by itself with the sensors and values that are available to the control through the axis feedback system. What is new in software version 18 of the TNC7 is that we now also give OEMs the option of integrating their own sensors into the machine and including them in the process monitoring capability. For example, this could be a vibration sensor with values that the OEM can loop into the process via the PLC and record as part of the process monitoring feature, and then continuously be included in the comparison during the comparison run.
Process monitoring is a very interesting topic, and interestingly enough, it is always the biggest discussion whenever we introduce the TNC7 somewhere. It doesn't matter whether it's with machine manufacturers or with users on site. The topic of monitoring processes and reacting to deviations is simply always a very interesting topic in this day and age, especially with all the automation aspects. And here the integrated process monitoring of the TNC7 really lends itself very well, because we don't need external hardware and external sensors. And if we want to integrate external sensors, we now also have a simple way of doing that.
And this means that process monitoring can now also be expanded by the machine manufacturer in any way desired, you could almost say, right? Then I would say, Mike, let's jump back to the programming enhancements. We have also done a few
I was just about to go there.
Your favorite
Yes,
topic.
my favorite topic, of course. My webinars are primarily aimed at the people who program the control directly, and thus naturally also live from the enhancements in HEIDENHAIN programming. And we have also included some new possibilities for this group of users. We have now finalized the package of OCM standard figures by including the last missing standard figure, circular slots. So now our, I could almost say, old school cycles of 250 and upwards are almost all replaced by OCM, which is a very nice application technology that we can use here. An almost funny anecdote is that we have now finally given a purpose to the only parameter at HEIDENHAIN that had no function.
The engraving cycle.
Exactly, the engraving cycle. It's been a topic over and over again for years now. The engraving cycle has been around for a very, very long time, the parameter for the font. Until now, whenever we introduced the cycle, we always had to say, there is only one font. Now we have expanded the fonts possible here by adding a couple of fonts. Now there is also the possibility here to program single-line fonts in other ways. And so now this parameter finally actually does something. There are still two small things we want to tell you about. One is the trans reset all function. Especially for all those of you who work with coordinate transformations a lot, it has often been like this. Okay, first I have to reset the datum shift, then cycle 10, and then cycle 8. So I had to reset each function individually. With the TNC7, we don't have to do any of this anymore, but instead we can now use trans reset all to reset everything at once. And we can almost retire another cycle, namely our good old cycle 14, which we still know from the SL cycles. Up to now, we still needed it to be able to assign individual contours with a label for a contour train, for example. We have now extended our contour select function and can now also call labels by using label names, label numbers, or string parameters. And so we are now completely flexible here.
So that was a gallop
Yes, that was a
through
sprint.
the most important innovations of software version 18. What remains for me is to conclude by inviting you to take a closer look at all of these things personally. After all, we offer a free download of the programming station for every software version, including for software version 18. It will be released once software version 18 has been released. I expect that we'll release software version 18 sometime around December, and then the programming station will be available shortly after that. So, download the programming station from our homepage and just try out all the new functions yourself. I think this will give you the best feeling for the new functions on your own computer.
So if there are still any questions, then please simply contact me. You are welcome to email me your questions as always. The contact details will be shown on the screen afterwards. I would like to thank you, Martin, for also taking the time to show our users out there what has been done from the development side. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much for your attention.
Always happy to do so.
Sehr gerne.
Until the next webinar, your Michael Wiendl.
Michael Wiendl.